Wyoming Territory, 1873. The late autumn wind howled across the open plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Jack Harrington pulled his worn leather duster tight around his lean frame as he urged his horse forward through the gathering dusk. At 26, Jack had already seen more of the harsh realities of the frontier than most men twice his age, and it had left him with one unshakable belief. A man alone was a man alive. The war had taken his father and brother. The frontier had claimed his mother to fever. Since then, he drifted from ranch to ranch, his skill with horses and cattle making him welcome wherever cowhands were needed, but he never stayed longer than a season. Attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got you killed out here where the law was still more suggestion than reality. "Just you and me, Rusty," he murmured to his chestnut gelding, the horse's ears flicking back at the sound of his voice. "The way it ought to be." But despite his words, an emptiness gnawed at him as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The ranch hands he'd just left behind would be gathering around the fire now, sharing stories and laughter. There'd been an invitation to winter with them, but Jack had declined. Better to keep moving than to let anyone get close enough to become a weakness. The small town of Elkhorn Creek appeared on the horizon just as full darkness settled, a scatter of golden lights promising shelter from the biting cold. Jack had stopped here once before, nearly 2 years ago. It was the kind of place where a man could find a hot meal, a night's lodging, and be on his way by morning without leaving so much as a footprint in anyone's memory. That suited Jack just fine. The main street was quiet as he rode in, most folks already tucked away in their homes for the evening. The saloon still showed signs of life, piano music drifting out into the night, but Jack headed straight for the small boarding house at the edge of town. He'd sleep, resupply at first light, and be gone before most of the town stirred. As he dismounted and led Rusty toward the small stable, a flash of movement caught his eye. A slender figure hurried down the steps of the boarding house, a shawl pulled tight around slim shoulders. The woman paused, seeming to sense his presence, and turned. Even in the dim light spilling from the windows, Jack could see she was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features set in an oval face. Her hair, pinned loosely at her nape, was a rich dark brown that caught the lamplight in surprising amber highlights. She wore a simple dark blue dress, modest but well-made, the kind respectable women wore for everyday tasks. "Oh," she said, clearly startled. "I didn't realize anyone was arriving so late." Jack touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, just looking for a room for the night." She studied him for a moment, wariness evident in the way she kept her distance. Smart woman, he thought. The frontier was no place for trusting strangers. "Mrs. Willow Davis," she introduced herself with a slight nod. "This is my boarding house." "You're in luck. I have one room available." Jack felt an unexpected jolt at the "Mrs." The woman was clearly a widow, likely left alone in this unforgiving territory. He wondered briefly what had happened to her husband, then reminded himself it wasn't his concern. "Jack Harrington," he replied, "just passing through." "They all are," she said with a small, enigmatic smile. "Stables around back for your horse. Dinner's finished, but I can warm something if you're hungry." Before Jack could respond, a small voice called from the doorway, "Mama." Mrs. Davis turned, her face softening immediately. "Emma, sweetheart, you should be in bed." A little girl of about 4 years peered around the doorframe, her dark hair falling in loose curls around a face that was a miniature version of her mother's. "I heard voices," the child said, eyeing Jack with open curiosity. "This is Mr. Harrington," Willow explained. "He'll be staying with us tonight, now back to bed with you." The little girl disappeared inside, and Jack found himself unexpectedly moved by the brief domestic scene. It had been years since he'd thought about family or children. Such things weren't for men like him. "Sorry for the interruption," Mrs. Davis said. "Please come inside when you've seen to your horse. I'll prepare your room." Jack nodded his thanks, watching as she disappeared back into the boarding house. There was something in her manner, a quiet strength combined with unmistakable caution, that spoke of someone who had learned the hard way that the West took more often than it gave. Just like him, he pushed the thought away and led Rusty to the stable. One night and he'd be gone, that was all. The boarding house was modest but meticulously clean, with simple furnishings that spoke of careful economy rather than poverty. Mrs. Davis showed him to a small room at the end of the hallway upstairs. Breakfast is at 7, she informed him, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. There's fresh water in the pitcher if you'd like to wash up. Thank you, ma'am. Jack set his saddlebags down, feeling suddenly awkward in this tidy, civilized space. He'd spent so many nights under the stars that four walls sometimes felt more confining than comforting. She hesitated in the doorway. You said you're passing through. Where are you headed, if you don't mind my asking? South, he said simply. Looking for ranch work for the winter. Something flickered in her eyes, consideration, perhaps. Well, you're welcome to stay more than one night if your plans change. The stage only comes through twice a week anyway. With that, she left him alone. Jack sat heavily on the bed, his body tired from long hours in the saddle, but his mind unexpectedly alert. There had been something in Willow Davis's manner, a barely concealed desperation beneath her composure, that tugged at him. Not your problem, he reminded himself firmly. In this world, everyone carried their burdens alone. It was the only way to survive. Morning came with pale sunlight and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up the stairs. Jack had slept better than expected, the bed a luxury after weeks of bedrolls on hard ground. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, finding several other guests already seated at the large dining table. Mrs. Davis moved efficiently between the kitchen and dining room, serving plates of food with quiet competence. Her daughter sat in a corner of the room, carefully dressing a cloth doll while occasionally glancing up at the strangers with curious eyes. Good morning, Mr. Harrington, Willow greeted him, gesturing to an empty chair. Coffee. Please, he nodded, noticing in the daylight that her eyes were a clear, deep green, unusual and striking against her dark hair. She couldn't have been more than 24, yet there was a gravitas about her that spoke of experiences beyond her years. The other guests, a drummer selling farm equipment and an elderly couple traveling to visit their son in Colorado, carried the breakfast conversation. Jack ate silently, observing rather than participating, a habit formed over years of solitary existence. He noticed how Willow subtly favored her left arm, wincing slightly when reaching for the coffee pot. An injury, perhaps, or strain from the physical demands of running the boarding house alone. Again, that sense that something wasn't quite right here nagged at him. As the other guests finished and dispersed, Jack remained at the table, finishing his second cup of coffee. Willow began clearing dishes, her movements precise but labored. You're hurt, he observed quietly. She stiffened, then continued her work. It's nothing, just strained my shoulder. Doing what? She glanced at her daughter, ensuring the child wasn't listening. Trying to fix a leak in the stable roof before winter sets in properly. I'm not much of a carpenter, I'm afraid. Jack thought of the stable he'd used last night. He'd noticed the patched areas, the obvious attempts of someone working beyond their skill but with determined effort. I could take a look before I leave, he offered, surprising himself as much as her. I've built my share of structures on ranches. Willow set down the plates she was holding, studying him with those remarkable green eyes. Why would you do that? The question was direct, without artifice, another surprise. Most women would have either accepted the help gratefully or politely declined. None would have questioned the motive so bluntly. Just returning the hospitality, he said with a shrug. Nothing more to it than that. She seemed to weigh his words, looking for hidden meaning. Finally, she nodded. I'd be grateful then. I can pay you something for your trouble. No need, Jack replied, standing. I'll have a look now if that suits. An hour later, Jack was on the stable roof, replacing several damaged boards and applying fresh tar to seal the leaking sections. The work was straightforward, requiring more strength than skill, and he found himself oddly satisfied by the simple, useful task. From his vantage point, he could see the entire property. The neat white boarding house with its small garden now harvested for winter, the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched in the dirt, and the empty corral that suggested Mrs. Davis had once kept livestock beyond the 2 milk cows that grazed nearby. It was a small operation, too much for a woman alone with a young child. Where were the men of the town who should be helping a widow? Jack wondered. Even in frontier communities, neighbors typically looked after one another, especially women left on their own. As if summoned by his thoughts, Willow emerged from the house with a cup in her hand. She approached the stable, shielding her eyes against the morning sun as she looked up at him. I brought you some water, she called, and to see if you needed anything. Jack climbed down the ladder, taking the offered cup gratefully. Thanks. Almost finished up there, should hold through winter now. Willow nodded, her eyes assessing his work. You've done more than I expected, I appreciate it. It needed doing, he said simply, drinking deeply. She took back the empty cup, her fingers brushing his briefly. Will you still be leaving today? The question hung between them, seemingly straightforward yet weighted with something Jack couldn't quite identify. He found himself hesitating, his firm plan to move on suddenly less certain. The stage doesn't come till tomorrow anyway, he said finally. Might as well stay another night. A flash of relief crossed her face, quickly masked. Well, as I said, you're welcome. I could use help with a few more repairs if you're willing. I can adjust your rate for the room. No need for that, Jack replied, happy to help. Her daughter appeared from around the corner of the house, running toward them with childish abandon. She stopped short when she reached her mother, suddenly shy in Jack's presence. Emma, Mr. Harrington is going to stay another day, Willow told her, smoothing the child's dark curls. He's fixing our roof. The little girl regarded Jack solemnly. Can you fix the step too? Mama says it's dangerous. Emma, Willow admonished gently. I can look at that next, Jack offered, finding himself smiling at the child's directness. What had intended to be one more night stretched into 3 as Jack repaired the loose porch step, a broken shutter, and several other small but essential items around the boarding house. Each day he told himself he would leave the next morning. Each day he found another reason to stay, a task unfinished, a repair that couldn't wait. The truth, which he reluctantly acknowledged to himself on the 3rd night as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, was that he was curious about Willow Davis. There was a mystery here, a young widow struggling alone, seemingly without friends or family to help her. The other townspeople, the few he'd encountered while purchasing supplies for his repairs, seemed to give her a wide berth. Not hostile exactly, but distant in a way that struck Jack as deliberate. On the morning of the 4th day, Jack made his decision. After breakfast, when the other guests had departed, he approached Willow as she worked in the small kitchen garden, harvesting the last of the season's root vegetables before the ground froze completely. Mrs. Davis, he began, I notice you don't have anyone helping with the heavier work around here. She sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with her forearm. The morning was cool, but the physical labor had brought color to her cheeks. As you can see, Mr. Harrington, it's just Emma and me. That's my point, winter's coming on hard, you've got repairs still needed, firewood to cut, livestock to tend. He paused, then continued carefully. I'm looking for winter work. I could stay on here, help with the place in exchange for room and board, maybe a small wage when you have it. Willow stared at him, surprise evident in her expression. You're a cowhand. Why would you want to winter at a small boarding house instead of a ranch? Jack shrugged, honest work is honest work, and this seems a quiet town. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. Mr. Harrington, you should know that I'm not. That is, my position in this town is somewhat complicated. Because you're a widow. A flicker of something pain perhaps crossed her face. Yes, because I'm a widow. Jack sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press. I'm not concerned with town gossip, Mrs. Davis. I'm offering fair work for fair compensation. She studied him for a long moment as if trying to read his true intentions. Finally, she nodded. All right, until spring then. But I have conditions. Name them. You'll take your meals with us but otherwise respect our privacy. No drinking, no card playing, no women visitors. Her voice was firm. And if I ask you to leave at any point, you go without question. The terms were strict but reasonable for a woman alone with a child. Agreed, Jack said simply. That evening, as Willow showed him to the small room above the stable where he would stay, giving his previous room in the house to paying guests, she paused at the door. Why are you really staying, Mr. Harrington? She asked directly. Most men your age are chasing fortune or adventure, not volunteering for winter work at a struggling boarding house. Jack considered his answer carefully. I've had my share of both fortune and adventure, he said finally. Found neither particularly satisfying. And what would you find satisfying? Her gaze was steady, challenging. Don't rightly know, he admitted, but this seems as good a place as any to figure it out. A small smile touched her lips. Well, at least you're honest. Good night, Mr. Harrington. Jack, he corrected, if I'm staying on, might as well use my name. She hesitated, then nodded. Good night, Jack. Good night, Mrs. Davis. Willow, she said softly, then turned and walked back toward the main house, her figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the windows. Jack watched her go, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd spent years avoiding entanglement, protecting himself from the pain that came with caring. Yet here he was, deliberately putting down temporary roots in a situation that radiated complication. Whatever Willow Davis's story was, he suspected it would challenge his carefully constructed belief that solitude was the only safe path through this untamed land, and for reasons he couldn't yet articulate, he found himself willing to take that risk. The first heavy snow came 2 weeks later, transforming Elkhorn Creek into a landscape of pristine white. Jack had settled into a routine that surprised him with its comfort, rising before dawn to tend the animals and stoke the fires, taking breakfast with Willow and Emma, then working through a seemingly endless list of repairs and improvements around the property. Willow proved to be a fair employer, neither demanding nor overly grateful for his efforts. She worked alongside him when she could, between caring for guests and managing the household, revealing a practical intelligence and remarkable endurance. The boarding house rarely had more than 3 rooms occupied at once, enough to provide modest income but not prosperity. On this particular morning, Jack was splitting firewood when he noticed a wagon approaching down the snow-covered road. He paused, leaning on his axe as the vehicle drew closer. 2 men sat on the bench, both bundled against the cold, their breath visible in the frosty air. They pulled up at the boarding house, and Jack felt a flicker of unease at the way they surveyed the property. These weren't typical travelers looking for accommodation. "Help you fellas," he called, setting down the axe and walking toward them. The older of the two, a heavy-set man with a thick beard going gray, eyed Jack suspiciously. "Looking for Mrs. Davis. She's inside, your business." The second man, leaner with a pockmarked face, spat into the snow. "Ain't yours to ask, Cowboy." Before Jack could respond, the front door opened and Willow emerged, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She froze momentarily at the sight of the visitors, then squared her shoulders and descended the steps. "Mr. Peterson," she acknowledged the bearded man coolly. "I wasn't expecting you." "Figured that," Peterson replied, "but thought it time we continued our discussion from last month." Willow's expression remained composed, but Jack noticed how her hands tightened on her shawl. "There's nothing to discuss. My answer remains the same." Peterson sighed heavily as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Mrs. Davis, be reasonable. You can't maintain this place alone, especially not through winter." "My offer is fair, more than fair, given the circumstances." "What offer?" Jack asked, moving to stand beside Willow. She shot him a warning glance, but Peterson answered readily enough. "I'm looking to expand my holdings. This property sits right where I need it. I've offered Mrs. Davis a good price, enough to set herself up comfortably in town or even back east." "I've told Mr. Peterson I'm not interested in selling," Willow said firmly. "This was my husband's property, and I intend to keep it." The second man laughed unpleasantly. "Your husband's been gone 2 years now, Widow Davis. Time to be practical." Jack sensed the undercurrent of threat in the words, and his hand instinctively moved closer to his waist where his revolver would normally hang. But he'd left the weapon in his room, seeing no need for it while chopping wood. "The lady's given her answer," he said evenly. "Best you respect it." Peterson's eyes narrowed as he assessed Jack more carefully. "And who might you be?" "Jack Harrington, I work here." "Since when does the widow need hired help?" the pockmarked man asked suspiciously. "Since it's my business who I employ," Willow interjected. "Now if you'll excuse us, Mr. Peterson, we have guests arriving on the afternoon stage." Peterson didn't move immediately. He studied Willow, then Jack, clearly recalculating his approach. "Winter's just beginning, Mrs. Davis. It's going to be a long, hard one from all signs. My offer stands for now, but don't expect it to remain open indefinitely." He picked up the reins and nodded to his companion. "Think on it, we'll be back." As the wagon pulled away, Jack turned to Willow. "What was that about?" She watched the departing visitors for a moment before answering. "Albert Peterson owns most of the businesses in town and half the surrounding land. He's been trying to buy my property since my husband died. Why is he so interested in a small boarding house? Willow's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. It's not the boarding house, it's the land. Thomas, my husband, bought 500 acres when we settled here. Most people thought he overpaid for what looked like poor grazing land. And 6 months after he died, the territorial survey confirmed what Thomas had always suspected. There's a substantial water source running under the eastern section. In Wyoming Territory, water rights are as good as gold. She finally looked at Jack. If Peterson controls the water, he controls who can ranch or farm for miles around. Jack let out a low whistle. No wonder he's persistent. Persistent is one word for it, Willow said grimly, but I won't sell. This land was Thomas's dream, his legacy for Emma, and frankly, that water should belong to everyone who needs it, not just whoever can afford Peterson's prices. She hugged her shawl tighter as a gust of wind swirled snow around them. I should get back inside. Emma will be wondering where I am. As she turned to go, Jack called after her. Is that why folks in town keep their distance, because you're standing up to Peterson? Willow paused, her back to him. Partly, she said softly, and partly because of how Thomas died. People talk, and not always kindly. Before he could ask more, she continued up the steps and disappeared inside, leaving Jack with more questions than answers. What had happened to Thomas Davis, and how far would Peterson go to get what he wanted? That evening, after Emma had been put to bed, Jack found Willow sitting alone by the fire in the small parlor. The boarding house was empty of guests. The stage had arrived carrying only mail, no passengers, and the quiet seemed to fill the rooms like a physical presence. She looked up as he entered, setting aside the mending she'd been working on. I suppose you want to know the rest of it. Jack took a seat in the chair opposite her. Only if you want to tell me. Willow stared into the flames for a long moment. My husband was shot, she said finally, 2 years ago, almost to the day. They found him at the boundary of our property where it meets Peterson's land. Who shot him? No one knows for certain. There was a dispute about some cattle that had strayed onto our land. Thomas went to speak with Peterson's foreman about it. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. He never came home. And the law? A bitter smile crossed her face. The sheriff investigated, ruled it a tragic accident, said Thomas must have fallen from his horse, causing his rifle to discharge. She shook her head. Thomas was an excellent rider, and he was shot from the front, not at an angle that would suggest a fall. You think Peterson had him killed, Jack stated, not a question. I think Thomas stood in the way of what Peterson wanted. She looked up at Jack directly, just as I do now. The implication hung in the air between them. If Peterson had arranged one death, he might not hesitate to arrange another. That's why you were surprised I offered to stay on, Jack realized. You thought no one would risk associating with you. Willow nodded slowly. Peterson has influence. Anyone who relies on doing business in town can't afford to cross him. I don't do business in town, Jack pointed out. And I've dealt with men like Peterson before. They mistake money for power, but they're usually cowards at heart. Be careful, Jack, she warned. Peterson isn't just wealthy, he's desperate. The railroad's coming through next year, and whoever controls the water rights stands to make a fortune. She paused. I don't want another death on my conscience. Thomas's death isn't on your conscience, Jack said firmly. Isn't it? Her green eyes reflected the firelight, revealing a pain she usually kept carefully hidden. He bought this land because I wanted to settle somewhere permanent. I was tired of moving from place to place. If I hadn't insisted. You can't think that way, Jack interrupted. Your husband made his choices, so did Peterson. Willow fell silent, turning her gaze back to the fire. After a moment she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been so afraid for so long, not just for myself but for Emma. Every noise at night, every stranger who comes to the door, I wonder if this is when Peterson finally decides to take what he wants by force. The vulnerability in her admission stirred something in Jack, a protectiveness he'd thought long buried beneath years of deliberate detachment. He'd avoided entanglement precisely because he knew how it felt to lose those you cared about. Yet here he was, already feeling responsible for this woman and her daughter. He'll have to go through me first, Jack said quietly. She looked up, studying his face with those perceptive green eyes. Why would you put yourself at risk for us? You barely know us. It was a fair question, one Jack had been asking himself since he'd decided to stay. Maybe I'm tired of just passing through, he said finally. Maybe there are some things worth standing for. A small smile touched her lips. For a man of few words, you occasionally say exactly the right thing, Jack Harrington. The firelight cast a warm glow on her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheek and the rich brown of her hair. In that moment, Jack realized with startling clarity that he was in danger of caring far more than he had intended. And for the first time in years, the thought didn't send him reaching for his saddlebags. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought both peace and tension. The boarding house had few visitors during the harsh weather, giving Jack time to make substantial improvements to the property. He repaired fencing, reinforced the barn, and even constructed crude but effective irrigation channels to direct spring runoff toward the fields come thawing time. Willow worked alongside him when she could, revealing a quick mind and practical nature that Jack increasingly admired. In the evenings, the three of them, Jack, Willow, and Emma, would gather in the warmth of the kitchen. Sometimes Jack would whittle small animals from scraps of wood for Emma, who delighted in each creation with childish enthusiasm. Other times, Willow would read aloud from one of the few books she possessed, her voice bringing the words to life in the lamplight. These quiet domestic scenes affected Jack more deeply than he cared to admit. He found himself looking forward to them, planning his day's work so he would finish in time for dinner with Willow and Emma. It was dangerously close to feeling like family, something he had convinced himself he neither wanted nor deserved. Emma, for her part, had gradually overcome her initial shyness around Jack. She now chattered freely in his presence, following him around the property when her mother allowed it, asking endless questions about the animals and his work. "Did you ever shoot a bear, mister?" "Jack," she asked one afternoon as she watched him repair a bridle in the stable. "Once," he admitted, "but only because he was fixing to eat me first." Her eyes widened. "Was he very big?" "Bigger than that hay wagon," Jack said solemnly, hiding his smile as she gasped in amazement. "Emma," Willow's voice called from outside, "time to come help with supper." The little girl jumped up immediately. "Coming, Mama," she hesitated at the stable door, then turned back to Jack. "Will you tell me the bear story tonight, the whole thing?" "If your mama says it's all right," he promised. Emma skipped off toward the house, and Jack found himself smiling as he returned to his work. The child's innocent trust was something he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps not since his own childhood, before the war had taken his father and brother and set him on this solitary path. His reflections were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Jack set aside the bridle and moved to the stable door, his hand instinctively checking for the revolver he now kept at his waist whenever he was working outside. 3 riders approached the boarding house, moving at a leisurely pace. As they drew closer, Jack recognized the lead rider as Peterson, with his pockmarked companion beside him. The third man was a stranger, tall and lean, with a city-cut coat that marked him as someone unused to frontier life. Jack stepped out into the yard as they reined in, positioning himself between the riders and the path to the house. He nodded curtly but didn't speak, waiting for them to state their business. "Harrington," Peterson acknowledged him with similar brevity. "Mrs. Davis around?" "She's busy," Jack replied. "What do you need?" The pockmarked man, Jack had since learned his name was Decker, Peterson's foreman, sneered openly. "Still hiding behind hired help, is she?" Jack ignored the provocation, keeping his attention on Peterson. The older man gestured to his well-dressed companion. "This here is Mr. James Whitaker from the Territorial Land Office. He's come to inspect some property boundaries." Peterson smiled thinly. "Official business. Best get Mrs. Davis." Before Jack could respond, Willow emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She approached steadily, though Jack noticed the tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Peterson," she greeted him with cool politeness. "What brings you by?" Whitaker removed his hat, revealing thinning hair and a face that spoke of too many comfortable meals. "Mrs. Davis, a pleasure. I understand there's some question about the exact boundaries of your property." Willow's expression remained composed, but Jack saw her hands tighten on her apron. "There's no question at all, Mr. Whitaker. My husband purchased 500 acres with clearly marked boundaries. I have the deeds inside." Yes, well, Whitaker cleared his throat, Mr. Peterson has raised some concerns about potential surveying errors when the original property lines were drawn. As an official representative of the territorial government, I'm obliged to investigate such claims. What kind of errors? Jack asked sharply. Peterson intervened smoothly. Nothing to concern yourself with, Harrington. This is between Mrs. Davis and the proper authorities. He turned to Willow. We'll need to examine the eastern section of your property where the underground spring is located. And there it was, Peterson's true objective laid bare. If he could get the boundaries redrawn, he might claim the water rights for himself without having to buy Willow's property outright. This is ridiculous, Willow stated, anger finally breaking through her composed exterior. Those boundaries have been established for years. My husband and I have paid taxes on that land since we arrived. Whitaker shrugged apologetically. Nevertheless, Mrs. Davis, I have the authority to conduct a new survey if legitimate questions arise. We'll begin tomorrow morning if that's convenient. And if I refuse, Willow challenged. Then I would be forced to issue a temporary injunction against any use of the disputed land until the matter is resolved in territorial court. Whitaker's tone suggested this would be a lengthy and expensive process. I'm sure we can resolve this amicably, however. Jack watched Peterson's satisfied expression and felt a surge of anger. The man had clearly bribed or coerced the land office representative into this charade. We'll be ready for your inspection tomorrow, Jack stated firmly, stepping forward, with our own documentation. Peterson's eyes narrowed. This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. I work this land, Jack replied evenly. That makes it my concern. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only when Whitaker cleared his throat again. Well then, shall we say 9 o'clock tomorrow? With the weather holding, we should be able to complete the inspection in one day. Willow nodded stiffly. 9 o'clock. As the three men rode away, she turned to Jack, her face pale but determined. This is Peterson's new strategy. If he can't buy me out, he'll try to steal the water rights through legal manipulation. Can he do that? Jack asked. I don't know, she admitted. Thomas kept all the property documents meticulously, but I'm not familiar with territorial law regarding disputed boundaries. She looked toward the house where Emma watched from the window. I need to speak with someone who is. Who? Willow hesitated. There's a lawyer in Laramie who helped Thomas with the original purchase. If I could get those papers to him, he might be able to advise me before tomorrow's inspection. Jack calculated quickly. Laramie's 30 miles. In good weather, I could make it there and back by morning if I leave now. No, Willow said immediately. It's too dangerous in winter, especially with night coming on. The trail gets treacherous in places. I've ridden worse, Jack assured her, and Peterson's counting on you being unprepared tomorrow. This may be our only chance to counter whatever he's planning. She studied his face, clearly torn between the need for help and concern for his safety. Why would you risk this for us, Jack? This isn't your fight. The question echoed her earlier one from weeks ago, but now Jack found he had a clearer answer. Maybe it should be somebody's fight. People like Peterson count on decent folks being too afraid or too alone to stand up to them. Willow held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded decisively. I'll get the papers. Within 20 minutes, Jack was mounted on his horse, the precious documents secured inside his coat. The afternoon was already fading toward dusk, and clouds on the horizon suggested more snow might be coming. Follow the main road as long as you can, Willow instructed, standing beside his stirrup. The lawyer's name is Samuel Grant. His office is just off the main street in Laramie, near the hotel. Jack nodded, memorizing the details. Jack, Willow added, her voice softer now, please be careful. Emma and I, she stopped, seeming unsure how to continue. I'll be back by morning, he promised. Just make sure you and Emma stay inside with the doors locked tonight. I don't trust Peterson or his men. She nodded, stepping back as he urged his horse forward. Jack didn't look back as he rode away, focusing instead on the challenge ahead. But he carried with him the image of Willow standing in the snow, her dark hair escaping its pins in the wind, concern evident in those remarkable green eyes. It was enough to keep him warm through the long, cold ride ahead. The journey to Laramie proved even more arduous than Jack had anticipated. darkness fell quickly, and with it came a bitter wind that drove stinging snow into his face. The trail, never well marked even in good weather, became treacherous as fresh snow obscured its boundaries. Jack relied on instinct and his horse's sure-footedness, pushing forward through increasingly difficult conditions. By the time the lights of Laramie appeared in the distance, both man and beast were exhausted and half frozen. Finding Samuel Grant proved another challenge. The town was battened down against the weather, windows shuttered and streets deserted. After several inquiries at the hotel, Jack was directed to a modest house on the outskirts where Grant apparently lived above his small office. The lawyer, roused from his evening meal, was initially irritated at the interruption, but when Jack explained the situation and showed him the documents Willow had sent, Grant's demeanor changed completely. "Peterson's trying this again, is he?" the older man muttered, examining the papers by lamplight. "He tried something similar while Thomas was still alive, claimed there had been a surveying error that put part of his grazing land inside the Davis property." "What happened?" Jack asked, gratefully accepting the hot coffee Grant's housekeeper provided. "Thomas had all his documentation in perfect order, just as I'd advised. Peterson couldn't make the claim stick." Grant looked up at Jack with shrewd eyes. "But Thomas Davis is gone now, and Peterson clearly thinks his widow will be easier to intimidate." "He's wrong about that," Jack said firmly. Grant studied him thoughtfully. "Yes, I believe he is, especially now that she has someone standing with her." He returned to the documents, making notes on a separate sheet of paper. "This land office representative, Whitaker, you said." "I know him, competent enough but with expensive tastes and a weak character. Exactly the sort Peterson could influence." "Can they really redraw the boundaries after all this time?" Grant shook his head. "Not legitimately, no. The original survey was conducted by the territorial government and properly recorded. Peterson knows this. He's counting on confusion and intimidation to get what he wants." The lawyer worked for another hour, preparing a detailed response to the challenge and noting the specific legal statutes that protected Willow's claim. When he finished, he sealed everything in an envelope and handed it to Jack. "Give this to Mrs. Davis. It contains everything she needs to refute Peterson's claims tomorrow." He hesitated. "But be careful, young man. Albert Peterson isn't accustomed to losing, and he doesn't fight fair." Jack nodded grimly. "I've gathered that." "There are rumors," Grant added quietly, "about what happened to Thomas Davis. Nothing that would stand up in court, but enough to make me worry for his widow and child." "I won't let anything happen to them," Jack stated, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. Grant smiled slightly. "I believe you won't. Now you should get some rest before heading back. The storm's worsened since you arrived." But Jack shook his head, already pulling his coat back on. "I promised I'd return by morning." They're alone at the boarding house. Despite Grant's protests about the danger of night travel in a snowstorm, Jack mounted his weary horse and turned back toward Elkhorn Creek. The return journey was even more grueling, with visibility reduced to mere feet in front of him and the cold penetrating even his heavy coat. Several times he lost the trail completely, forced to backtrack and search for landmarks he could recognize in the swirling snow. What should have been a 5-hour ride stretched to 8 agonizing hours of slow progress through increasingly deep drifts. Dawn was breaking as Jack finally approached the boarding house, his body numb with cold and fatigue. Through the driving snow, he could make out the familiar shape of the building, but something seemed wrong. There was too much activity for this early hour, horses in the yard, figures moving about. As he drew closer, alarm shot through him. Peterson's wagon was there, along with 4 mounted men, and they were not waiting patiently for the scheduled 9 o'clock meeting. They appeared to be forcing their way into the house. Summoning his last reserves of energy, Jack urged his exhausted horse forward. As he approached, he could hear raised voices, Peterson's commanding tone and Willow's defiant responses. She stood on the porch, blocking the entrance to her home, while Peterson and Whitaker faced her from the yard. Decker and the other men remained mounted, watching the confrontation with predatory interest. "The inspection was scheduled for 9 o'clock, Willow was saying firmly. "You have no right to demand entrance to my home before then." "Mrs. Davis, I'm afraid circumstances have changed," Whitaker replied, sounding uncomfortable but determined. Information has come to light suggesting your claim may be based on fraudulent documentation. As a representative of the Territorial Land Office, I have the authority to examine all relevant materials immediately. What information? Willow demanded. My husband's claim is perfectly legitimate, as you'll see when your hired hand returns with whatever papers you sent him to fetch, Peterson interrupted, his tone mockingly sweet. I'm afraid Mr. Harrington won't be joining us this morning. The pass to Laramie is treacherous in this weather. Accidents happen so easily. The implied threat was clear, and Jack saw fear flash across Willow's face before her expression hardened again. If you think I believe for one moment that this is a legitimate inspection, you're a fool, Albert Peterson, she stated coldly. This is nothing but theft wearing a legal mask. Peterson's face darkened with anger. Careful, Mrs. Davis. Accusations like that could be considered slander. He turned to Whitaker. I believe we've given the widow ample opportunity to cooperate voluntarily. Perhaps it's time to execute the search warrant you brought. Whitaker nodded reluctantly, reaching into his coat, but before he could produce any document, Jack's voice cut through the tension. That won't be necessary. All heads turned as he guided his horse into the yard, snow caking his coat and hat. The shock on Peterson's face would have been comical under different circumstances. Harrington, the older man, recovered quickly. Surprising to see you back so soon, and in one piece. Disappointed? Jack asked mildly, dismounting with effort. His legs nearly buckled as they took his weight after so many hours in the saddle. Willow's relief was palpable, though she maintained her composed stance. As you can see, gentlemen, we're fully prepared for the inspection at the agreed-upon time. Jack approached the porch, handing Willow the sealed envelope from Grant. The lawyer sends his regards, he said quietly, and his complete support. She took the documents, her fingers briefly touching his. Thank you, she whispered. Turning back to Peterson and Whitaker, Jack positioned himself beside Willow on the porch steps. Now, unless you gentlemen have an actual warrant, not whatever fiction you were about to produce, I suggest you return at 9 as planned. Mrs. Davis and I have preparations to make. Whitaker looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between Peterson and the determined pair on the porch. Perhaps it would be best to adhere to the original schedule, he suggested to Peterson, to ensure all proprieties are observed. Peterson's jaw tightened in barely suppressed rage. For a moment, Jack thought he might order his men to force the issue. Instead, he nodded stiffly. 9 o'clock, he agreed. But this changes nothing, Mrs. Davis. The law will take its course. As they mounted and rode away, Willow turned to Jack, concern replacing her defiant expression. You look half frozen. Come inside immediately. Once inside, with the door firmly locked behind them, Willow's composure finally cracked. I thought something had happened to you, she admitted, helping him remove his snow-crusted coat. When they showed up at dawn, making those claims about fraudulent documents. That was their plan all along, Jack said, his voice rough from the cold and fatigue. They hoped to catch you alone and unprepared. Emma appeared from the kitchen, her eyes wide. Mr. Jack, you came back. Despite his exhaustion, Jack managed a smile for the child. Promised I would, didn't I? Willow urged him toward the fire, bringing hot coffee and blankets. As warmth gradually returned to his limbs, Jack explained what he had learned from the lawyer. Willow opened Grant's envelope and read through the documents, her expression growing more confident with each page. This is exactly what we need, she said finally. Grant has cited the territorial statutes that protect our claim and included official copies of the original survey markers. She looked up at Jack, her eyes bright with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. Just stand your ground when they return, Jack replied. Peterson's counting on intimidation more than legal standing. Willow nodded, straightening her shoulders. I intend to. When Peterson and his party returned at 9, they found Jack and Willow waiting calmly, all documentation laid out on the dining room table. With Grant's legal guidance and the official copies he had provided, Willow methodically dismantled every challenge to her property boundaries. Whitaker, clearly uncomfortable with the increasingly transparent nature of Peterson's claims, eventually conceded that the original survey appeared entirely accurate and legally recorded. The Territorial Land Office finds no basis for adjustment to the existing property lines, he declared formally, avoiding Peterson's glare. The Davis claim stands as recorded. Peterson's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, he said quietly as they prepared to leave. There are other ways to settle property disputes out here. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his revolver. I'd reconsider that line of thinking, Peterson. Threatening a widow and her child won't play well, even in a territory where the law has flexible boundaries. Who's threatening? Peterson replied with a cold smile. Just stating facts, winter's long and hard. All sorts of accidents can happen. With that parting remark, he and his men departed, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. He won't stop, Willow said softly, watching through the window as the riders disappeared into the swirling snow. This just means he'll try something less legal next time. Jack nodded grimly, likely. She turned to face him, her expression resolute despite the fear he could see beneath it. You should go, Jack, you've done more than enough already. I won't have you risking your life in someone else's fight. It became my fight when I decided to stay, he replied simply. I'm not leaving you and Emma to face this alone. Willow studied his face, searching for something, doubt perhaps, or hidden motives. Finding neither, she nodded slowly. Then we face it together. That night, after Emma was asleep, Jack and Willow sat by the fire discussing what might come next. The house was quiet, the snow having finally stopped to leave a pristine white landscape outside the windows. We should consider what Peterson might try, Jack said, cleaning his revolver methodically. Intimidation hasn't worked, and he failed with legal manipulation. That leaves more direct approaches. Willow's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. You think he'll resort to violence? I think he's already responsible for one death on this property, Jack replied quietly, and he wants that water badly enough to risk another. Willow's face paled, but she nodded. What do we do? First, we make this place as secure as possible. Then we make sure Peterson knows that taking what he wants won't be as easy as he thinks. Jack reassembled his gun with practiced efficiency. And we reach out for help. Help? Willow looked skeptical. From whom? Most people in town are either afraid of Peterson or indebted to him. Not everyone, Jack countered, and not everyone lives in town. There are homesteaders and small ranchers in the area who would benefit from fair access to water if they knew what Peterson was planning. Understanding dawned in Willow's eyes. A coalition, strength in numbers. Exactly, Jack nodded. Peterson's power comes from isolation, making each person feel they have to face him alone, but together people have more options. For the first time since Peterson's visit, Willow smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. Thomas used to say something similar, that the frontier only works when people stand together. Your husband sounds like he was a good man, Jack said quietly. He was, Willow confirmed, her gaze distant with memory. Idealistic, perhaps. He believed in building something lasting here, not just taking what could be grabbed and moving on. She refocused on Jack. Rather like you in some ways. Jack shook his head. I've been a drifter most of my life. Not much for putting down roots. And yet here you are, Willow observed, risking everything for a piece of land that isn't yours and people you barely know. Before Jack could respond, a sound from outside caught his attention, the soft crunch of footsteps in snow. He motioned for silence, moving quickly to extinguish the lamp. In the sudden darkness, he drew his revolver and moved to the window, carefully peering around the edge of the curtain. Two figures moved stealthily toward the barn, barely visible in the moonlight reflecting off the snow. From their build and movement, Jack recognized Decker and one of Peterson's other men. Stay here, he whispered to Willow. Lock the door behind me. Before she could protest, he slipped out the back door, moving silently despite the snow underfoot. Years of hunting and tracking served him well as he circled wide, approaching the barn from the side opposite the intruders. He reached the barn just as Decker and his companion disappeared inside. Easing the door open, Jack heard low voices and saw the flicker of a lantern being lit. He moved deeper into the shadows, watching as the two men approached the stacked hay at the far end. Peterson said make it look accidental, Decker was saying. Fire's the cleanest way. Dry hay, winter wind, whole place will go up before anyone can stop it. What about the woman and kid? His companion asked, voice hesitant. Decker shrugged, not our concern. Peterson wants this problem solved one way or another. The cold fury that swept through Jack was unlike anything he'd felt in years. These men were casually discussing murder, not just of him, but of Willow and her innocent daughter, all for a piece of land and the water beneath it. He stepped forward, revolver leveled, dropped the lantern. Slowly. Both men froze, then Decker turned, his hand moving toward his waistband. Harrington, he spat, should have known you'd be playing watchdog. Hand away from your gun, Jack ordered. I won't ask twice. For a tense moment, Decker seemed to consider his options. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his hands. His companion followed suit, looking significantly more frightened. Now what? Decker challenged. You going to shoot us in cold blood? That's murder, even in Wyoming Territory. Attempting to burn down a house with people inside is also murder, Jack replied evenly. I'm thinking the law might take an interest in that. A harsh laugh escaped Decker. The law, Sheriff Connors owes his position to Peterson. You think he'll take your word over ours? Maybe not, Jack conceded. But I'm not planning to shoot you, not tonight anyway. He gestured with his revolver. You're going to leave and you're going to take a message back to Peterson. The Davis property is protected, not just by me, but by people throughout the territory who have an interest in fair water access. What people? Decker scoffed. Nobody's standing with the widow. That's what Peterson wants you to believe, Jack said coldly. But things change, word spreads, and men like Peterson eventually discover they're not as powerful as they thought. He could see uncertainty flicker across Decker's face. Now get moving, Jack continued. And understand this, if anything happens to Mrs. Davis or her daughter, there won't be a place in this territory where you or Peterson will be safe. That's not a threat. That's a promise. The conviction in his voice must have registered because Decker and his companion backed slowly toward the door. Peterson won't stop, Decker warned as they reached the entrance. Not until he gets what he wants. Then he's in for a disappointment, Jack replied. Now go. He watched as the two men mounted their horses and rode away, keeping his revolver ready until they disappeared from sight. Only then did he release the breath he'd been holding, the full reality of the situation settling over him. Peterson had escalated from threats to attempted murder, and Jack had no illusion that this would be his last attempt. When he returned to the house, he found Willow waiting anxiously, a shotgun in her hands. The sight of her, determined to defend her home despite her fear, stirred something deep within him. They're gone, he assured her. For now. What did they want? She asked, lowering the shotgun. Jack hesitated, reluctant to tell her how close they had come to disaster, but he respected her too much for comforting lies. They were planning to burn the barn. With the winter wind, it would have spread to the house quickly. Willow's face paled, but her voice remained steady. Because of the water rights. Yes. She set the shotgun aside and sank into a chair, her composure finally wavering. My God, Jack. He's willing to kill us all, even Emma, for this land. Jack knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. I won't let that happen, but we need to be realistic about what we're facing. Peterson has money, influence, and men willing to do his dirty work. We need to build our own strength. Willow looked up, her green eyes meeting his directly. How? Tomorrow, I'll ride out to the neighboring homesteads and smaller ranches. Like I said, there are plenty of people who would benefit from knowing about the water source on your land, and who would be harmed if Peterson controlled it exclusively. Understanding dawned in her expression. A coalition against Peterson. Exactly, Jack nodded. Not just for protection now, but for the future. Your husband was right about building something lasting. Water rights should benefit the whole community, not just the richest man. Willow studied his face in the firelight. This isn't what you signed on for, Jack. When you offered to stay for the winter, you couldn't have known it would come to this. No, he agreed, but I'm not sorry I stayed. Why? She asked softly. You could leave tonight, be miles away by morning, start fresh somewhere without these complications. It was a fair question, one Jack had asked himself repeatedly over the past weeks. The answer had been evolving, shifting from simple decency to something far more personal and profound. "I've spent years drifting," he said finally, "staying nowhere long enough to care what happened to a place or its people. It felt safer that way after losing my family." He paused, gathering thoughts that had been forming without his full awareness. "But there's no real living in that kind of safety, just existing." Willow's hands tightened around his. "And now? Now I've found something worth standing for," Jack said simply. "People worth protecting." He met her gaze steadily. "Worth caring about." The silence that followed was weighted with unspoken meaning. Then Willow leaned forward slowly, deliberately, and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that began as gentle gratitude but quickly deepened into something more urgent. When they finally drew apart, Jack saw in her eyes the same recognition that had been growing in his own heart, that what had begun as a temporary arrangement had become something neither had expected or sought, yet both now treasured. "We should get some rest," Willow said softly. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Jack nodded, rising to his feet. Before he could move toward the door, Willow caught his hand. "Stay," she whispered, "not in the stable. Here where I can know you're safe." It was a practical request. They both knew Peterson's men might return, but the intimacy of it hung between them, new and fragile yet undeniable. "I'll sleep down here," Jack agreed. "By the fire." Willow nodded, seeming both relieved and something more complex. "Good night, Jack." "Good night, Willow." As she disappeared up the stairs, Jack settled into the chair by the fire, his revolver close at hand. The house creaked and settled around him, no longer just a place of employment but something approaching a home. And with that realization came both comfort and fear, comfort in the belonging, fear in what he now stood to lose. Peterson might have underestimated Willow Davis's determination to keep her land, but Jack knew he had underestimated something far more dangerous to his carefully constructed solitude: his own capacity for love. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the snow-covered landscape gleaming in the winter sunlight. Jack set out early, visiting the scattered homesteads and small ranches that dotted the area surrounding Elkhorn Creek. At each stop he explained the situation: the water source on the Davis property, Peterson's attempts to seize control of it, and what that would mean for everyone who might need access to that water in the future. To his gratification, many listened with growing concern. Peterson had made enemies over the years with his expansionist approach to business, and the idea of him controlling essential water rights alarmed even those who had previously kept their heads down. By mid-afternoon, Jack had secured tentative support from 7 families, not a large number but significant in this sparsely populated region. More importantly, several were respected old-timers whose opinions carried weight with others. As he headed back toward the boarding house, Jack felt cautiously optimistic. Peterson's power depended on isolation and fear. Breaking that isolation was the first step toward changing the balance of power. He was within sight of the Davis property when he noticed the fresh tracks in the snow, multiple horses, heading toward the boarding house. Alarm surged through him as he urged his mount forward, cresting the small rise that overlooked the yard. What he saw sent cold fear through his veins. Peterson's wagon was there, along with 6 mounted men, but it wasn't their presence that caused Jack's heart to pound. It was the sight of Willow being forcibly restrained by Decker while Peterson himself carried a struggling Emma toward the wagon. Without hesitation, Jack spurred his horse down the slope, drawing his revolver as he rode. He fired a single shot into the air, causing the men to freeze and turn in his direction. "Let them go," Jack called, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Now." Peterson recovered quickly from the surprise, his expression hardening. Harrington, always turning up at inconvenient moments. He nodded to his men, who spread out, hands moving to their weapons. Jack kept riding, closing the distance rapidly. "I won't say it again, Peterson. Let the child go." "Or what?" Peterson challenged, still holding the frightened Emma. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy. One wrong move and this situation becomes tragic for everyone." Jack reined in his horse about 30 yards away, his revolver now pointed steadily at Peterson. "You're forgetting something," he said calmly, despite the rage building inside him. "I don't have to win a gunfight against all your men, I just have to make sure my first bullet finds you." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Peterson's face as he recognized the truth in Jack's words. At this range, even in a crossfire, Jack could almost certainly put a bullet in him before falling. "You'd risk the child?" Peterson asked, using Emma as a shield. "I won't need to," Jack replied evenly. "Because you're going to let her go and step away. You're a businessman, Peterson. Calculate the odds. Are water rights worth your life?" For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the sound of approaching riders broke the standoff. Jack didn't dare look away from Peterson, but he heard the hoofbeats growing louder, multiple horses approaching fast. "Boss," one of Peterson's men called uncertainly. "We got company." 7 riders appeared over the rise, each armed and grim-faced, the same homesteaders and ranchers Jack had visited that morning. They spread out in a loose semicircle, effectively surrounding Peterson's group. "What's this?" Peterson demanded, his grip on Emma loosening slightly as he assessed the new threat. "This is what community looks like," Jack answered. "People who understand that water belongs to everyone, not just whoever can steal it." The oldest of the newcomers, a weathered rancher named Holt who had worked this territory for 30 years, spoke up. "Peterson, you're done here. Let the child go and clear out, or this gets settled the old way." The implied threat hung in the air. Frontier justice could be swift and final, especially for those who threatened children. Peterson's face contorted with frustrated rage as he recognized his position had become untenable. Abruptly, he set Emma down, giving her a small push away from him. "Run to your mother, sweetheart," Jack called steadily, keeping his revolver trained on Peterson. The little girl bolted immediately toward Willow, who had taken advantage of Decker's distraction to break free. She caught her daughter in her arms, backing quickly toward the house. "This changes nothing," Peterson snarled, though his bravado sounded hollow now. "You can't guard this place forever, Harrington, and you," he turned to the gathered ranchers, "you're making a dangerous enemy today." Holt spat contemptuously. "Better dangerous enemies than cowardly friends, Peterson. Now mount up and ride out, unless you fancy seeing what frontier justice looks like for men who threaten women and children." Recognizing defeat, at least for the moment, Peterson signaled to his men. They mounted silently, the tension still thick in the air. Before riding away, Peterson fixed Jack with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he stated flatly. "Yes," Jack contradicted him. "It is," he nodded toward the gathered ranchers. "These men now know about the water source, and they know what you tried to do today. That story will spread. How long do you think your influence in town will last once people hear you were willing to kidnap a child?" For the first time, uncertainty showed clearly on Peterson's face. His power had always depended on a veneer of legitimacy, on being feared but also respected as a successful businessman. That facade was now crumbling before his eyes. Without another word, Peterson turned his horse and rode away, his men following closely behind. Jack watched until they disappeared from sight, then dismounted and hurried to where Willow stood with Emma clutched tightly in her arms. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, examining them both for signs of injury. Willow shook her head, her face pale but composed. "They came suddenly. I didn't have time to," her voice broke. "They said if I didn't sign over the property, they would take Emma to ensure my cooperation." Jack gathered them both in his arms, his heart still pounding with residual fear and anger. "It's over now," he murmured. "You're safe." Holt and the other ranchers approached, dismounting respectfully. "Mrs. Davis," the older man greeted her. "Sorry we nearly arrived too late. Your man here made a compelling case this morning about the importance of your water rights to the whole community." "I can't thank you enough for coming," Willow replied, her voice steadying. "Please, all of you, come inside where it's warm. We have coffee and food to offer." As the group moved toward the house, the tension gradually eased. Inside, gathered around Willow's large kitchen table, a new alliance began to form. The ranchers and homesteaders, previously isolated by distance and the harsh demands of frontier life, found common cause in protecting shared resources. "What we need," Holt suggested, warming his hands around a coffee mug, "is a formal water association. Something legal that guarantees fair access to everyone and prevents any one person from controlling it all." "My husband had similar ideas," Willow said, Emma now calm and settled on her lap. "He envisioned irrigation channels serving multiple properties, with maintenance shared among all users." The discussion continued as plans took shape. By the time the visitors departed in the fading afternoon light, a framework had been established for a cooperative agreement that would protect the water source for the benefit of all. "We'll keep an eye on Peterson," Holt assured Jack as they stood on the porch. "After today, he'll think twice before moving against Mrs. Davis directly, but watch your back all the same. Men like him don't forget easily." Jack nodded, shaking the older man's hand. "I appreciate your help, all of you." When the last rider had disappeared, Jack turned to find Willow watching him from the doorway, her expression soft in the gathering dusk. "You did this," she said quietly. "You built an alliance where there was nothing but isolated families before." Jack shook his head. The foundation was already there. People just needed to be reminded that they're stronger together than apart. Willow stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face gently. "You could have been killed today, Jack, when I saw you riding in alone against all of them." She shuddered at the memory. "I wasn't going to let them take you or Emma," he said simply. "Why?" she asked, echoing her question from the night before, but with new significance after the day's events. Jack had spent years keeping emotional distance, protecting himself from the pain of loss by never allowing himself to care too deeply. But standing here looking into Willow's eyes, he found he could no longer maintain that distance, nor did he want to. "Because you've become my home," he admitted quietly, "both of you. And a man protects his home." Tears welled in Willow's eyes, but they were accompanied by a smile that transformed her face. "I never thought I would find this again," she whispered. "After Thomas died, I believed that part of my life was over. That all I could do was survive and keep Emma safe. And now," Jack asked, his voice rough with emotion, "now I'm ready to live again," Willow said simply, "with you if that's what you want too." Instead of answering with words, Jack drew her gently into his arms and kissed her, not with the urgent passion of the previous night, but with tender promise. A beginning rather than an ending. When they finally separated, Willow rested her head against his chest. "Stay with us, Jack, not just for the winter, stay for good." The request held everything he had convinced himself he would never have again: a home, a family, roots that went deep into the land and the community, the very things he had fled from after losing everyone he loved. But as he held Willow in the gathering darkness, Jack realized that his years of drifting hadn't protected him from pain, they had only prevented him from fully living. And here, against all odds, he had found not just purpose but love. "I'll stay," he promised, his voice steady with certainty, "as long as you want me." Willow looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. "That would be forever, Jack Harrington." "Forever sounds just about right," he agreed, and sealed the promise with another kiss. Spring came to Wyoming Territory in fits and starts, with warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, until finally the land committed to renewal. As the snow retreated, revealing muddy ground that gradually firmed and greened, Jack and Willow worked side by side to expand the boarding house and implement the water association plans. The alliance formed during winter's darkest days had strengthened with time. Peterson, his reputation damaged by the stories that spread about his attempted kidnapping of a child, found his influence in Elkhorn Creek diminishing. When the territorial marshal investigated the circumstances of Thomas Davis's death, prompted by statements from several of Peterson's former employees, the businessman quietly sold his holdings and departed for Colorado. On a perfect June morning, with wildflowers dotting the plains and cottonwoods fully leafed along the creek, Jack stood beside Willow on the porch of what was now their home. Emma played nearby, her laughter carrying on the warm breeze as she chased a butterfly through the garden Jack had helped her plant. "The first stage with the new route comes through today," Willow remarked, leaning against his side. "That should bring more regular guests now that we've added the new rooms." Jack nodded, his arm around her shoulders. The expansion of the boarding house had been his project through the late winter and spring: 4 additional guest rooms and a proper dining hall that could accommodate travelers on the newly established stage line that would connect Elkhorn Creek to Laramie and beyond. "Holt says we should expect the first Water Association meeting to have at least 15 families represented," he added. "The irrigation channels to the eastern properties should be finished by midsummer." Willow smiled up at him. Thomas would have been so proud to see his vision taking shape, a true community working together. "He laid the foundation," Jack acknowledged. we're just building on what he started." The sun caught the simple gold band on Willow's finger, a match to the one Jack now wore on his own hand. Their wedding 2 months earlier had been attended by nearly everyone in the county, marking not just their union but the rebirth of Elkhorn Creek as a community bound by mutual interest and support rather than fear. "Any regrets?" Willow asked softly, a question she still posed occasionally, as if marveling at the change in their circumstances. Jack looked out over the land that had become his home, the flourishing garden, the expanded stable where he now bred and trained horses as a side business, the creek that would soon bring water to multiple properties through carefully constructed channels. Then he looked down at the woman beside him, whose strength and determination had first caught his attention but whose capacity for love had ultimately transformed his life. "Not a single one," he answered truthfully. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." Emma ran up to them, her dark curls bouncing and her green eyes, so like her mother's, bright with excitement. "Papa Jack, I caught a grasshopper, come see." The name still sent a wave of emotion through him each time she used it. Shortly after the wedding, Emma had asked if she could call him Papa, since her real father was in heaven and couldn't be with them. Jack had been unable to speak past the lump in his throat, managing only a nod before gathering the child in his arms. Now he let her take his hand and lead him down the steps, turning to wink at Willow over his shoulder. She watched them go, her expression serene with the contentment of a woman who had fought for her home and family, and won. Jack Harrington, once convinced that the frontier offered nothing but solitude and survival, had found something far more valuable in the vast Wyoming Territory. Not just land or water or security, but the very thing he had stopped believing in after so much loss. A future built on love, strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the West might bring. As he knelt beside Emma to examine her insect discovery, with Willow's laughter joining theirs in the clear morning air, Jack knew with absolute certainty that he had finally come home.